Hello and welcome to this virtual event that is part of Brain Taxi's 2021 Twin Cities Book Festival. I'm Eric Lorber, the director of Brain Taxi. We are a nonprofit organization that champions aesthetically adventurous literature. If you don't yet know much about us, I invite you to check out our website anytime after this event to learn more about our quarterly magazine of critical writing and all the other great programs we produce to help drive readers to where writing is going. This event, like most of our events, is free to attend. But if you are able to pitch in a little something, feel free to use the donate button at the bottom of your screen. Some funding for our festival comes from the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council and the Minnesota State Arts Board, but our most vital support always comes from individual readers just like you. Whether you're a one-time donor or you'd like to become a Rain Taxi member and stay in touch with us year-round, we're grateful for your support. Don't forget there are other ways to participate tonight. You can use the chat to share your comments and observations. We love that. If you have a question for the authors, use the Ask a Question box, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. And of course, you can buy books. And tonight, if you purchase either Bumerán by Achy Obejas or Mutiny by Phillip B. you'll be supporting not only our festival, but Majors and Quinn Booksellers, a great independent store here in the Twin Cities. I'm just so thrilled to have both of these poets with us. I feel like their work speaks not only to the depth of the human spirit, but to the moment that we all find ourselves in. And I'm equally thrilled to have leading our discussion tonight our longtime literary comrade, poet Gary Dop. Gary is well-versed in how poetry meets people in the moment as the director of creative writing at Randolph College, among other things. So I leave you in his good hands. Please welcome all of our guests and take it away, Gary.
Thanks, Eric. It's good to be at the Twin Cities Book Festival and to be engaged in this event with Phillip and Achy, two poets who chart new territory in the landscape of identity and community. We'll begin, before we get into the conversation portion, we'll give a chance for each poet to read a few poems for us, and then we'll talk about their work and their new books. As a way to start, the bios for these two poets. Phillip B. is the author of Mutiny and Thief in the Interior, which received the 2017 Kate Tufts Discovery Award and a 2017 Lambda Literary Award. He's also the author of the chapbooks Bruised Gospels and Burn. Williams' work has appeared or is forthcoming in Boston Review, Callaloo, Kenyon Review, The New Republic, The New Yorker, and many others. He's the recipient of a 2020 NEA grant, a 2017 Whiting Award, and a 2013 Ruth Lilly Fellowship. He serves on the faculty at Bennington College, and he's a founding faculty member of the Randolph College Low Residency MFA. And an all-around great guy. Achy Obejas is a Cuban-American writer, translator, and activist whose work focuses on personal and national identity. Her story collection, The Tower of Antilles, was a Penn Faulkner finalist, and her novel, Days of Awe, was called one of the best books of the year by the Los Angeles Times. Her poetry has appeared in Prairie Schooner, Tri-Quarterly, another Chicago magazine, and many other publications. A native of Havana, she currently lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, and her latest collection is Bumerang, Bumerán. Phillip, would you begin us with a couple of poems?
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Very happy to be here. All right. The Flying African. The bird minstrels shrill vulgar mimetics of my folklore song. In whispered incantations, wings scar clean from my back, shake shadows like pools of night over slave quarters mangled with cotton. Belief in me makes me a belonging, curves me scintillant into half moon like a scythe cradling the sun. Anansi could never. In Georgia, I heel-spun once and took off toward Igbo land, Atlantic water foaming, a hellhound's maw beneath me. Carolinian mansions undressed to ruin as my black feathers curtained Doric columns and draped over Ole Missus a death veil. I wedded Cuba and departed in the hurricane's revolving hunger, a Marioja snatching palm leaves from my swamp-whelmed hair, unbreakable tail. I shapeshift, my body many-birded, as a serpent winds my throat, reminder of the soil that waits against the wake of 100 undead ships, carrying me to a living crisis. Need by need, it mattered who needed me, the enslaved unbound by their making me. I contort, beck, and call to resurrect the drowned, bloating in the dark sail of a dream. If the truth is that the captured chose the ocean over chains, then I am hope's raw epistle, love lettering alibis against the grave. I carry the stolen many in my mouth, readying for rebellion. Each captured day, I arrive with a new face carved for retribution. My grin, an orphanage of blades. Final poem for the deer. Deer asleep on the side of the road. No, deer dead there as always, preserved in the book of symbols. Deer with its flies and uncanny arrows in its sides like compass needles or fleshless wings. Deer whose hooves punctured names in the snow. Deer who knows your name. Deer, a white-tailed Gnostic in the woods, deer you get lost in, deer with a ribbon of brass bells around its neck and an iron sword in its antlers altar. Dear Emperor, surveying a funeral from afar, hoofing open cracks in the vagaries of the fool who wanted a deer, but instead got a deer. Deer in the mind taking place of the deer. Always its assignment. Here, the casket carrying the father is a deer, four cloven hooves upon the red carpet, a blown up photograph of the father's past face, a road sign saying the future is still. Boy who refuses to view his body's father, afraid of the face he will not recognize, for addiction has its way with the flesh. Deer casket marching out the church to where the earth is gentler to flesh, strips it patiently. Deer carrying the dead in its spine cradle, the scent of pears beckons from the bassinet of bone. The dead carrying the dead. The arrows in the deer tremble toward their cardinal affairs. The skin someone forgot the feel of. The mama who never said goodbye. The daddy whose belly rolled on its side like a truck struck deer. There is no daddy here. The father sits up in his casket, startled, his funeral full of his sons. No, his one son repeating like a paper cutout, a forest of sons in which the deer tilts its decorous head into the father's grave and sips.
Thank you, Philip. Achy?
That's hard act to follow. Thank you for that. I'm reading for Boomerang, and the first piece I'm going to read is called The President of Coca-Cola. Ana Mendieta is the president of Coca-Cola and dresses in yellow. A mother of millions, an international pop star rolling by the riverside covered in spit and feathers. Ana Mendieta is the U.S. Senator from Florida, the governor of New Hampshire, 4 feet 10 inches seared into wood, traced with blood, formed from mud and grass and gunpowder. She leans on the bar counter, a mentirita in her hand. Ana Mendieta is the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg, a prestigious professor of international law at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations. Ana Mendieta is a shadow play of light in the cornfields of Iowa, a mound of earth outside Havana, cave drawings. She's the mayor of Wichita, the tender-hearted sibling of the late dictator, a glamorous fashion model, welfare recipient, emergency case in the emergency room, a soldier, dentist, and historian, the host of a daily talk show on Telemundo, who gulps down a milky black cow every day before taking calls. Ana Mendieta is the intellectual author of Miami's Resurgence, the evil genius behind the bombing of a plane that killed every member of the national fencing team, and the man who ripped out his lover's guts when she moaned the name of another. Ana Mendieta is a power hitter MVP and 6-time All-Star celebrating at a gay B&B on Duval Street with a chocolate slam and a tray of cocaine. Ana Mendieta is the president of Coca-Cola and a double agent. She invented the sitcom, the telephone, birthed Amazon, came over with 14,000 kids and got deported with 2,021 others, mostly murderers. Ana Mendieta fears that if she weren't an artist, she'd be devoted to a life of crime. Ana Mendieta is subject and object. She's overwhelmed by feelings of being cast out of the womb, from the island, from exile. Ana Mendieta is the target of racism and a particularly fierce misogyny. She has a wicked cackle, a cruel flutter of hands. She swallows a dark and dirty and eye of the storm, a fucked up float. Ana Mendieta is the goddamn president of Coca-Cola, and she's both gleeful and embarrassed by the millions she earns, but also keen on what all that money can do. She's on the outside looking in, and so in with the in crowd. Ana Mendieta is alone. She pushes and presses her face against the glass until there's a tiny hairline fracture that snakes back and forth, and the glass separates so she can pop each piece with her fingers. Ana Mendieta is the youngest of all, the last to open her eyes when Earth was created. She's the feminine ideal, the masculine ideal, the non-binary ideal, and inspires lust and fruitfulness. She loves handheld fans and mirrors and is constantly dipping her fingers in honey jars. Ana Mendieta loses interest quickly. She's a peacock, a sack of bones, a woman dozing on the roof of a deli 33 stories down. The second piece is called In Response to the Murder of 11 Jews, including a 97-year-old said to be a Holocaust survivor who wasn't. If they preferred tea with honey, take a step back. If they watched police procedurals, if their ankle throbbed or their hands swelled and they didn't complain, or they did, take another step back. If they missed being in love with its anticipations, a hand caressing the small of their back, take a third step. Or maybe they'd forgotten, held it like a souvenir postcard from long ago, colors faded. If they had children, and their children had children, and their children's children had children, maybe they hadn't forgotten their needs, but found instead a love deeper than love, fathomless and devout. They were simply going through the motions, which now gave them a warm and glowing contentment that came to them like breath. Bow. If they recalled the headlines from those other times, bend knees. The hours volunteering at a soup kitchen, writing pen pals in uniform. Bow. If they remembered fear, or if they'd grown immune, so saturated with it, it had transformed into a fourth prayer. If they understood what happened when it happened, if their hearing caught the stranger's cry, if they pondered for an instant, if they were dreaming or confused, fall down. The wind blows, the rain falls, the sick are healed, the bound released. Gather exiles from the four corners of the earth onto the land. Reassemble here, body upon body.
Thank you. Thank you, Achy. Thank you both. It's a powerful way to begin. Achy, both of your poems use the word exile, and I think the word exile is something you're regularly thinking about addressing in a lot of your work, and maybe that brings us to where we can begin with place and relationship to place in both of your work, and how that language of the word exile specifically for Achy, that might be a way for you to bring us into it. And then Philip, as we're hearing Achy's, the same thing to you. What is the idea of place for you as you're navigating, writing about Africa in that first poem in particular, and a movement through quite a few spaces there. But Achy, would you begin us with your sense of that in your work?
Yeah, I came to the United States when I was 6.5. I came out on a boat with my parents. We were exiles from the Cuban Revolution in 1959. We came in 1963. I was very young. I was just a kid. And you would think that having spent the vast majority of my life in the United States and becoming fluent and accentless in English, and presenting for the most part white, that it would not be that hard to shed those particular roots. But the fact of the matter is that the condition of exile, which is what my parents were, they didn't choose to come here to have a better life in the sense that immigrants come here. They chose to come here because my father was wanted for resisting the Cuban Revolution of 1959, and we couldn't go back for a long time. There was no possibility of going back. Certainly for my parents, there was no possibility of going back. It's a haunting thing. It just marks everything in my life. I did a stint as a writer in residency in Hawaii, and it's always been one of the most interesting things in the world to me because nobody in Hawaii gives a damn about Cuba, right? Like, really, it shouldn't have come in play at all. I mean, it just is not in the mindset of most people. They're thinking, if they're thinking outside the U.S., they're thinking, China and Japan and the Eastern universe, not the Western Hemisphere. And yet, for me, every single experience I had in Hawaii was marked by being Cuban. Really simple stuff. Like in Hawaii, nobody turns their back to the ocean. Like, it's a really big deal. And I kept doing it by accident. And people would turn me around and say, no, the fact of the matter is that in Havana, everybody turns their back to the water. Everybody sits along the seawall. And, this is how you spend your day. You spend your days hanging out, and your back to the seawall is no big deal. Everybody in Hawaii knew how to swim. Nobody in Cuba knows how to swim. Which is weird because we're an island country, but it's just big enough so that you have a lot of people who live not close to the coast, and so they never learn. And even a lot of people, in the cities and on the coast don't learn. I mean, people don't realize that there are no beaches in Havana. There's a coast, but there are no beaches. So, you have 2 million people who are basically in a situation where the ocean's right there, but it is meaningless to the sort of casual relationship with water that one has when one has an actual beach. So everything was marked by this notion of Cuba. And in my own experience, compared to people who have a very different relationship to their island and to their colonizers than what we had.
Yeah, and you've written about I think, or spoken about how that perspective on Cuba is often as although there's a place your family was leaving, it's also a place that had very progressive possibilities and experiences in terms of gender and sexuality.
No, Cuba has no progressive positions on sexuality, and I've never written about that.
Oh no, okay, then I'll come back to whatever.
No, Cuba had concentration camps, labor camps for gay people in the 60s.
That maybe it was post that people went back there to escape, that you talked about. Sorry, to escape the Western controls. They would go to Cuba as a space to leave that in the past.
I think prior to 1959, when Cuba was known as the brothel of the Caribbean, people went to Cuba to do all the things they couldn't do in the U.S. And there were live sex shows, and it was very much a gay capital of Latin America because it was a sexual capital of Latin America.
Yeah, my apologies. That's what I was trying to refer to. But So, and Philip, for you, when you're thinking about place, and particularly in that first poem you're writing about, it's moving through multiple spaces and places. How does that enter into the work you're composing?
With Mutiny, I was most interested in devaluing the education that I've gotten, which is poetry comes from Europe. Religion, spirituality comes from the Western civilization, and focusing more on just some of the steady research that I've been doing. I'm no scholar by any means, but digging more into what does it mean to be part of a African diaspora, and what does it mean to then incorporate these different realities, spiritual realities, folktales, myths, cultural artifacts, songs into the poems, where in a lot of cases that they wouldn't be understood, let alone welcome. And then two, not understood and not welcomed by whom, right? And so there are all of these assumptions and presumptions that I just really wanted to do away with, because it was keeping me from identifying with a lot of the ways that I wanted to move in the world. I wanted to be seen, and wanted to also be understanding of all of the things that have been kept from me in the education system, you know. So there's a reason why there are very few Greek myths mentioned, and if they are, they're destroyed, or they're used to destroy themselves. And you know, I'm going more into thinking of the um, Igbo, Yoruba, Candomblé, Santeria, Voodoo, Hoodoo in particular. And not to say that I have extensive knowledge of this, but to point to the reasons why I don't. And trying to write poems that are moving toward, you know, building that foundation.
And if we're thinking about that, the heritage in a way that you're intentionally disconnecting from, what are there writers right now or in the recent past that you're saying this is what I am connecting with, that are influential on your work?
Yes, there is Nathaniel Mackey, Jay Wright, and Gil Jones, um, Toni Morrison, of course. And there's, in many ways, Sonia Sanchez, with the way that she thinks about vocalization in work, right? Percussion in work. Her use of metaphor is very not Western. You know, what she pays attention to and how she pays attention to, especially when she thinks about Black children. This it's rare that you can get that. You can see people get that right, who are not Black, right? So yeah, there are quite a few folks who I think have already started doing this work. I'm not, you know, I don't want anyone to think that what I'm doing is new. I'm trying to be in conversation.
Yeah, and Achy, for you, are there the same question? What is the, and then maybe we'll have you both read a poem here in a second after this. But Achy, for you, what is that connection or heritage that you're writing within in connection to, for in your mind?
I mean, I feel like, you know, I'm shadowed by this island, you know. I mean, I feel like I'm just haunted by it at every turn. But I mean, I think we have different relationships to place at different times in our lives, you know. And early on, you know, when I was younger, Cuba was this very, very far away place. It was sort of like a Shangri-La. And, you know, later, I actually went to Cuba in 1985 for the first time. And I developed a very intimate relationship with Cuba. I ended up spending a tremendous amount of time there in the next like 18 years. In 1999, I actually spent almost the entire year in Cuba. And, you know, they went from this very sort of romantic relationship of, you know, oh, finally returned to the homeland, you know, and you know, I was more Cuban than the Cubans who lived in Cuba, and then the harsh reality of day-to-day life sort of hits you, and you start experiencing not just, you know, the inconveniences, but you start seeing the political problems up close, and you start questioning things in a very different way, and then it just becomes a very complicated experience. I always thought, though, that there would be some eventuality in which I would return to Cuba to live, that I would like spend my last days in Cuba, that I would retire in Cuba. And then when I had kids, that changed pretty dramatically, because I realized that while I was willing to take chances with things as far as I was concerned, you know, my own body, the integrity of my soul, I was a lot less willing to take those chances for my children. And it really distanced me in some ways. Also, when my kids came around, I realized the importance of my own family and time that I had always reserved for Cuba. I then reserved for Miami for the simple reason that my mother lived in Miami. And I wanted my children to have a connection to my mother and my mother to have a connection to my children. It became like remarkably important to me for my mom to be, you know, a presence for them to have a memory of my mother. And so, you know, homeland became my mother in this very important way. And Cuba became very distant and very abstract. You know, it's only in the last year or so when there have been so many things going on in Cuba. You know, a lot of the uprisings, and there's another one coming up next month, which is going to be really ugly, and that's sort of brought me back around because a lot of my friends are very involved in the protests and in the planning and stuff like that, and their lives are very much at stake, and and so that has made me think about that again, but also to think about it in terms of my own privilege that I'm here, you know, and I get to talk about it here, but I'm in the safety of Benicia, California.
And yet doing your part writing
these
poems that work into that space. Would you read one for us?
Sure. Actually, the one I'm going to read to you now is called The March. It's the last piece in the book, and I'm going to read it in Spanish first, and then I'm going to read it in English, and those will be my two poems. But this was a poem that came about when I went to see the Black Panther exhibit at the Oakland Museum. It was a really stunning exhibit to begin with. It really kind of reminded you of how incredibly important this group was. And a friend of mine, former alderman from Chicago, Helen Schiller, was visiting. Helen used to be associated with the Black Panthers and stayed with me during the week that the opening was happening. So I had her sort of like right up close to ask questions and talk to and hang out. And it was just an absolutely stunning experience for me. And this poem sort of came from all of that. I always feel like it's important to give credit to both that exhibition because it was so fantastically done, and also Helen because her life's work has just been phenomenal. It's called, and this is written in a non-binary Spanish, so it might sound a little bit different than the Spanish that a lot of people are more familiar with. La marcha. Estoy a punto de salir a los elementos y mi anticipación es una larga inhalación que cubre el mundo tras soltarse. Este es el comienzo de un movimiento basado en hechos y no en sentimientos o pronunciamientos, aunque ambos sentimientos y pronunciamientos son útiles y dignos. Cuando empiezo a levantar mi pie izquierdo, mi músculo sartorio permite que mi rodilla se mueva hacia mi cuerpo. Me acompañan otros. No obstante, pueden unirse conmigo otros que han sufrido y que no tienen miedo de seguir sufriendo. Lo que buscamos es una nueva mayoría arraigada a la justicia para todos aquellos cuya conciencia está comprometida a poner fin al mal y hacerle bien. No queremos nada sobre nosotras sin nosotras. Lo que queremos es que cada individuo defina su propia identidad y pueda tener la expectativa de que la sociedad le respete. Desplazamos nuestro peso, desbloqueamos nuestras rodillas, disponemos nuestros cuerpos de la mejor manera para cada uno de nosotros. Por un instante, la mayoría de nosotros estamos parados sobre un pie. No tenemos prisa, no estamos soñando, estamos dispuestos a renunciar a todo, incluso a nuestras vidas. Lo haremos sin violencia porque esa es nuestra convicción, de que queremos es libertad, de que queremos es el poder para determinar nuestro destino. Mientras mi pie izquierdo baja, está coordinando con mi derecha y coinciden con el movimiento equivalente de aquellos que se han unido a mí y a los que me estoy uniendo. Estamos firmemente arraigados. Siempre que sea posible, dejamos que nuestros miembros se muevan de manera natural y mantenemos nuestras cabezas hacia adelante. Lo que queremos es la eliminación completa de las fuerzas militares, no solo de este o aquel territorio, sino de todos los rincones, de todos los puestos fronterizos sobre la tierra. Lo que queremos es trabajo pleno y significativo. Lo que queremos son viviendas decentes y seguras. Lo que queremos es una educación que nos enseñe nuestras verdaderas historias y sus consecuencias sobre el presente. A medida que cada uno de nosotros levanta el pie derecho o hace el movimiento paralelo para moverse, ahora somos una fuerza perfectamente sincronizada, incluso en nuestras diferencias y desorden ocasional. Lo que queremos es una detención inmediata de la brutalidad estatal y el asesinato de los negros y los indígenas y las personas discapacitadas y las personas trans y las mujeres y las niñas y las madres y los padres que solo pueden hacer ese tanto porque están encadenados por el mismo Estado que busca matarles por haber creído absurdamente que eran libres. Lo que queremos son las puertas abiertas a Folsom, Riker, Guantánamo, San Quentin, San Juan de Lurigancho, ADX, Florencia, Supermax, La Sabaneta, Arca, Campamento 22, Portsmouth. Sería fácil pasar por alto la urgencia del momento. A medida que avanzamos, somos un ruido de trueno. Algunos de nosotros correrán bajo la lluvia en Seattle y hacia el tráfico para bloquear Lakeshore Drive en Chicago. Otros inundarán Wall Street y otros más serán una tormenta en el puerto de Oakland. Habrá una alma solitaria en la nevada de Bethel, Alaska, y un puñado en Little Rock, en la sofocada Ferguson, en Tallahassee, Flagstaff, Baltimore, Detroit, Honolulu, Boise, en la antigua Salem, Wichita y Northampton, Oklahoma City y Spearfish en Dakota del Sur. El nervio y el músculo se adaptan al estímulo rítmico de nuestro propio ruido, el ruido que hacemos juntos. Es cierto que cuando en el transcurso de los acontecimientos humanos se hace necesario que una persona se conecte a otra y a otra y a otra para defender nuestra igualdad, nuestra diferencia, nuestra dependencia, le une del otro, entonces... A lot of that piece borrows from the Black Panther manifesto, the Trans Manifesto. There's a variety of different documents that I just left the language and or slightly change. Anyway, let me read it in English really quick so people have a sense of what I'm talking about. March. I'm about to step outside. I'm about to step outside to the elements. And my anticipation is a long inhalations that covers the world upon release. This is the beginning of a movement based on facts and not on sentiment or pronouncements, though both sentiment and pronouncements are useful and worthy. As I begin to lift my left foot, my sartorius muscle allows my knee to move up towards my body. I'm joined by others, however they can join with me, others who have suffered and are not afraid to continue suffering. What we seek is a new majority rooted in justice for all whose conscience is committed to seizing wrongs and doing right. What we want is nothing about us without us. What we want is for each individual to define their own identity and expect that society will respect them. We shift our weight, unlock our knees, arrange our bodies in the best way for each of us. For an instant, most of us are standing on one foot. We're not in a hurry. We're not dreaming. We're ready to give up everything, even our lives. We shall do it without violence because that is our conviction. What we want is freedom. What we want is the power to determine our destiny. As my left foot comes down, it is coordinated with my right, and they march the equivalent movement of those who have joined me and with whom I am joining. We are firmly rooted. Whenever possible, we let our limbs swing in a natural motion and keep our heads facing forward. What we want is the complete elimination of military forces, not just from this or that territory, but from every corner, every outpost on earth. What we want is full and meaningful employment. What we want is decent, safe housing. What we want is an education that teaches us our true histories and their consequences on the present. As each of us lifts our right foot or makes the equivalent movement to ambulate, we are now a perfectly synchronized force, even in our differences and occasional disorder. What we want is an immediate stop to state brutality and the assassination of Black people and Native people and disabled people and queer people and trans people and women and children and mothers and fathers who can only do so much because they are shackled by the very state that seeks to kill them for having foolishly believed they were free. What we want are the doors flung open to Folsom, Rikers, Guantánamo, San Quentin, San Juan de Lurigancho, ADX, Florence Supermax, La Sabaneta, Attica, Camp 22, Portsmouth, It would be fatal to overlook the urgency of the moment. As we advance, we're a thunderous thrum. Some of us will run under the rain in Seattle and toward traffic to block Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. Others will flood Wall Street and more will storm the Port of Oakland. There will be one lonely soul in snowy Bethel, Alaska, and clusters in Little Rock, and sweltering Ferguson, and Tallahassee, and Flagstaff, Baltimore, Detroit, Honolulu, Boise, in ancient Salem, Wichita, and Northampton, Oklahoma City, and Spearfish, South Dakota. Nerve and muscle adapt to the rhythmic stimulus of our own noise, the noise we make together. It is true that when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one person to connect to another, and another, and another, in order to defend our equality, our difference, our dependence on one another, then.
Thank you, Achy. Would you, Philip, we'll have you read a couple poems in just a moment. Achy, would you say something about the structure of your book? And
Sure.
I mean, this flip structure and what
Yeah.
you're attempting to do in Spanish and English that is particularly challenging in terms of gender-free English.
Yeah. Yeah, the book is a flip book, and when you open it one way, it's completely in English, and when you flip it and open it the other way, it's completely in Spanish. It's the same pieces. We do not indicate which is the original, whether it's in English or in Spanish. Some were written in English, some were written in Spanish. The assumption has been by a lot of people that it's all been in English and then turned into Spanish, but that's not the case. And in the case of both languages, what I tried to do was to create a sort of a gender-free presentation. That was not that difficult in English because there's been a kind of a general agreement to use they as a non-gendered way to approach things. And I write a lot in second person, so that wasn't a big deal. But Spanish is a very binary language, and usually things that are masculine end in O and things that are feminine end in A. And here in the US, a lot of US Hispanics use the X, Latinx and stuff, but the X is unpronounceable in Spanish. And in Latin America, there's been a general rejection of the X. And what's been proposed is the E. And so the endings of words are in E in order to create this non-gender situation. Unfortunately, the way it's been used so far is that what gets changed is the person or the subject, and the rest of the language remains binary. So, for example, I could say, Philip looks great in his feminized glasses and in his, feminized room, drinking his masculine coffee, which doesn't seem to have a lot of utility to me. So I took it all out. I made it all binary, non-binary, and used the E sort of exhaustively. I still had to go back and regender a few things because in some cases, gender seemed crucial. The Ana Mendieta poem that I read initially, for example, I feel very strongly that Ana was murdered because she was a woman and that she experienced a lot of the pain and agony in the art world that she experienced at the time because she was a woman. So I went back and regendered, and it happened in a couple other places. But so that's the deal.
No, the way that poem ends after saying she is so many things, and then it says woman at the very end is really that lands really well, I think.
Thank you. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, Philip, Mutiny, take us into a couple of those poems, and I hope in somewhere in there too, it could be after the poems, you would address sound and your relationship to sound in particular. I think in the way that maybe that the choice with gender in Achy's book is so clear and present in the experience. Your sonic movement, your sound emphasis seems also very present for us as readers. But take us through a couple poems and.
All right. Well, now I have to find the sound poems.
They're all sound poems in your book. Have you read it?
You've themed it very specifically. Okay, hold on. I know of the two. I will read final poem for the moon. I'll read two sections from Mush Mouse May Be Crowned. One. Manacled man mangled, moreover made menace masked, maybe molded moribund, mostly manipulated. Magnanimously marred, mired, bush-mouthed, moored, more. Manacled man meanly measured, man monkey mixed miss murky mirrors, America's man, minstrel married mophead, magnum man, mama's mine. Might munched, manacled man mimics martyr movements, moshes minus music, muses, murdered made manifestations. My madness, my monster. 3. My mausoleum multiplies immemorial. Me misery, impossible emperor, and maybe me mid moonlight's improvisations. Me immediate, might's emissary, mayhem maims my museum. Me improvise minutes, masticate memory. Mortuary mammal, mythic, melisma minded, memory makes me meet myself minus mink, mirth, magic. Myself's mess makes me member muzzle mincing mouth. Maybe murder make my mouth mine.
Wow. Love that.
Thank you. Thank you. You see, I should have had my mic unmuted the whole time. I didn't. I was trying to be quiet, but thank you for that. Let's be organic. That's true. All right, final poem for the moon. My first lover, my clavicles chiseler sculpting me into blue lamentation and crucible for your lunacy. Summon me to scuttle forward, Cancer moon, Cancer rising, and fill myself on your dust-flashed milk, your gray honey, black-green grasses used to sharpen their night blades. My paramour who gowns me in a yawning glint, Helios's canvas by which you find your aspects, find your shape misshapen in 7/8, your eighth self finally filled with ochre blood or the ruddy salutations of familiar fever. You pass your sickness to me like fervor, my heart a moon learning all its phases at once. My idiolectum diaphragm, deliberate disc slip from tough spine. Elysium I pitch my body beneath, white morning glories opening from my sweat flushed back. I feel my veins heart plucked toward you. I rise like any body of water compelled into risk, pulled up the god ladder of your gibbous. You perfect your appetite in my blood, hematite of harvest, scolecite that pulls my blood waves to zenith in your skull of good omen, your lambent weight witness to worship and worry. I, a sun celibate celebrant ensconced in pearl, my mood unravels in your fingerless hand. I dance lute-backed in the armory of your niveous eye, your snake-fanged posture I hang from my ear, your crescent weaning me off your nectar. I will grieve your circumference, your diameter, your secant and chord, as you renew yourself with erasure. Moon as a mouth no more, moon as a wound no more, moon wound round my fist no more, moon in the grips of hunger, moon chip-toothed, goat-eye round in shock no more, moon no beast aspires to kiss, moon the color of my coming no more, misery moon, moon dipped in a whale, moon sick no more, moonward dust floats but lingers no more, moon heavy chimney no more, moon wash tongue washing me no more, full moon night chandelier no more. How high the no more moon? The cow jumps over the never moon. Moon river no more. Wider than a mile, my arms take the shape of you no more. Do not watch me while I look for you in the galaxy that breathes your many names. Tsukuyomi, Koyoshoki, Chang'e, Kansu. I am malazed by moon glut, moonstruck, lunatic eclipsed by my lips, supplicant. Oh.
Thank you.
And so you asked about sound in my work?
Yeah, I did, and I wonder if the answer is the work itself and not the how you want to speak to it. But you certainly can. I have a second question. If you'd rather let this work speak for itself in sound terms,
that might be smart. I might mess it up. So yes.
No. Yeah. Well, so Philip, one of the things that's written about your book that I think you had a hand in writing, but was in the description of your book is the transformative power of anger and the clarity that comes from allowing that anger to burn clean. How in your work do you see, and then we'll turn it over to some audience questions in just a second, but how do you see the desire and what are you trying to do when you say, I want the work to burn clean, the anger to burn clean?
Yeah, I had no input on that. I mean, I filled out a little survey, but that language came from my the assistant editor, who's brilliant.
Do you feel like it's a good reflection of? I mean, to me, it strikes
I do,
true.
I
Yeah.
do. I was very uh, happy with it, and I mean, and shocked by it because it's not very often that someone sees your work as clearly as you would like. And I think the idea of anger burning clean comes from, the considerations of anger being seen as dirty, as being seen as something that ruins, that messes up. It taints revolutions, it taints protests, right? Oh, they shouldn't have burnt that, they shouldn't have knocked that over. Well, it's like, well, anger is part of the human experience, right? And a lot of times when anger is not expressed, that's when it becomes most dangerous. It's not when it's expressed, it's when it's held in captivity to, the idea that we should always be celebratory, joyful, or a particular kind of peaceful that is digestible. And so I wanted Mutiny to, in its own kind of way, be reflective of anger's usefulness, in particular, especially when it's expressed in ways that can arguably be considered beautiful. I don't think people give anger enough credit for the beauty that it creates.
Yeah, well, certainly Mutiny is an example of that for us. So thank you. Eric's going to jump back in, I think, and we'll hear some questions from the audience if we have a few moments for that.
Absolutely.
We will, and thank you to you all. This is an amazing conversation and a glimpse of the beautiful work in these two books. I want to remind our viewers that you can purchase Mutiny and Bumerán from our bookseller tonight, Majors and Quinn, just by hitting that green button on your screen. To start with a question, I want to start with one that wasn't actually submitted tonight, but that's been burbling around in the conversations that I've been having. And it's actually, as I realize, it's been burbling for years now, that I've been hearing more and more that there may be a rebirth of political poetry. I'm not sure rebirth is the right word or that it ever went away, but an increasing awareness that poetry is one of the tools we have to address what is happening in political life, and that it's an important one. And so I'm just curious, because it's so clearly present in both of your work, how you view that. Do you see yourself in a tradition of political poetry, or see that whole idea evolving with the pressures of the current time? Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Achy, begin. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, Philip, do you want to go next? But
I can. I don't. It's the way that the word political is used. It's very confusing. In as much as everything that anybody ever writes has a politic to it. If there's a poem that is completely about trees or bushes, the politic is about how one sees trees and bushes and how they relate to it as an imagined speaker, or in their own, if they are the speaker, right, their own autobiography. And not to even dismiss the question. The question is one about a poem that is obviously has a political message that deals with a person or a people who want a kind of freedom, right? It's a loaded question in that way. But I want to be very specific about it, because it's not that political poetry is becoming more in vogue. It's a particular genre of political poetry that I think we might be seeing come into more popularity. It's always been written. I think there's also been resistance to a lot of the poetry that now, as academicians write it, I still consider myself to be a poet who is considered more a scholar, because I, teach, right? I get more of an audience than folks who've been doing this for longer than I've been alive. So, there's a way that having this conversation can be tricky. But to be as fair as possible to answer the question, I think what is happening is that there are more folks who are writing the thing who also have built-in audiences that are able to reach particular folks, that those who have been doing it for generations, who have been part of political movements, who have been doing it, have been silence is an interesting word, but who have been ignored or imprisoned or killed, doing the same work. And a lot of the work is relatively, I consider Mutiny to be, in comparison to that work, relatively tame. Right? So yeah, I just want to be very fair and as historical as possible.
Thank you. Yeah.
I don't know that there's any Cuban poetry that's not political. It always seems to land that way. And I think if you're a person of color in the United States, that, like Philip was just saying, you can be talking about trees, and it is not only inherently political, but it is essentially political.
Mm-hmm.
Because you are, I think, you're deciding to assert a point of view, which has not always been, granted to people of color, particularly, Black people and browner people than me, certainly. So I think it's it has no choice but to be political. And for some reason, there's someone ringing my doorbell. I'm going to find out who that could conceivably be. Be right back. Philip, take it away.
That's awesome. Wonderful. Yeah, no, just to continue on that topic a little bit, Philip, because Mutiny is so obviously touches that stone in our lives right now, and I think that people are hungry for that, are hungry for a path to a mutiny that feels possible and useful. But I want to tie it into where Gary maybe started earlier with personal identity as well. And you just spoke interestingly about your scholarship, and something I love about your work is how you bring in these traditions of African folklore and so many other readings. Say a little bit more about that blend, because I feel like I love, for example, reading even the notes in your books and how many sources you've drawn on to create these poems. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and most of that is because I, was going in with a kind of ignorance, and I wanted to project that. I wanted people to know that I'm not the. When I said earlier that I am a scholar, I think even earlier than that, I said I do not consider myself to be one. It's more of what is projected onto me because I teach at a school, and also that doesn't mean that other folks can't think of me as a scholar. It's just I don't see myself in that way, and what I wanted to do with the notes is be very generous to those who have foregrounded this knowledge, right? So thinking of like Christina Sharp, for instance, and Achy Phillip, and just to let people know that there is a framework already implemented by people who've been doing this research and have been considering some of the same things that I've been considering, and not that any of the work needs to be validated by research, but it is important to me to echo particularly with Mastery, which is playing with the wasteland and all those damn footnotes he had. I wanted to do something similar and say, well, there's a Black knowledge that is very vast, and I haven't even. This is not even a fraction. I mean, to call this a fraction is offensive. This is just as much as I could get into the book within the time limit and my own intellectual capacity. So yeah, it was really important to me to have these notes that led readers outside of Mutiny so that they can find other things to read about.
Right. And by the way, I want to let our viewers know that the way I'm talking about scholarship is not limited to the notes. And just to give an example, this beautiful poem, final poem for the Black Body, in which you do what you just said is give us a window into Black history and a reaction to it that is crucial and deep and very moving. So
thank you.
Achy, a kind of similar question. We're not going to ask you who was at the door. We're all burning. That would be the logical question. But the one I had wanted to ask was gender, what you started to speak about, that fascinating project and how it played out differently in the different languages. But what led you to that moment? What led you to say, I'm going to write this?
Well, a lot of the poems weren't written with that in mind. In fact, the way this whole book came together is kind of bizarre. I've always written poetry, and I've always found poetry to be very spiritually meaningful to me. Like every single day of my life, I read poetry. I read a minimum of 3 poems a day. And I just feel like it feeds me. Like I have to start the day this way. It feeds my prose. When I was doing journalism, it fed my journalism. It's just a way to sort of get a certain balance and to get into a particular place with language. And so I've always done poetry, but I never really thought of myself as a public poet. And what ended up happening was that a very good friend of mine, Lawrence Schimmel, who lives in Spain and is actually a writer of many, many books. You guys have probably sold a gazillion books of his because he's written like 130 or edited. He used to come and see me when I lived in Chicago. He'd spend like a week with me when he used to come in for conferences, and whether in Chicago or Madison or whatever. And every year he would come in and he would ask me about my poetry. He runs a poetry press, Midnight Summer's Dream, and it, I just finally one year just handed him all my spiral notebooks because that's where they were, and he put together a chapbook called "This Is What Happened in Our Other Life," which, to everyone's surprise, did very well, both critically and in terms of sales. And I had never thought about putting together something, but after that, I started thinking, well, maybe I should, maybe I could, maybe I, And then I contributed an essay to a book called Passing that was released by Beacon. And I had a lovely experience with them. I've been very lucky as far as the publishing houses that I've been associated with. And Beacon was just an extraordinarily good experience. And after I put this book together, I sent it to them, but I was at the same time thinking, no way. I mean, the rumors are going to, cut their poetry stuff or whatever. But, it's a house with a great poetry history. And I just very boldly sent this unagented, even though I have an agent who later said, "You did what? What about that novel that we're going to make money from?" And so to my shock and amazement, they went for it. But at the time, the manuscript, read like normal, typical, conventional English and Spanish. And as I started thinking more and more, especially because I live in California, and here we live and breathe gender in a very particular way. Like if this had been as a talk that originated in the Bay Area, we would have all started by giving our pronouns after we introduced ourselves. This is the typical, hello, how are you of the Bay Area. It's lingua franca. And it just prompted me to consider it. And so I went back and rewrote and redid all of this because gender is so in our heads. My kid had a nanny who went in a period of 5 years, went from Mara to Dinez, and to the point where my child thinks this is absolutely, typical. Like this is like as this happens every day, right? And it does happen every day, but it's always amusing to me. He has a cousin who lives in Iowa, and she's quite a tomboy and a terrific athlete, and she was bitching and moaning about how the boys got to do so many more things than she did, and she would just wish she was a boy. And my son said, well, you can be. You absolutely can be if you really want to. And I just thought, yeah, this is like a big deal that my kid thinks this way, that this is the future where my child is not bound to these notions of gender in the way certainly that my generation was. But then after I did that, I realized we're not there yet. We're just not there yet. And to erase Ana Mendieta's gender would be a sin. It would be erasing Ana Mendieta. And to erase Hemingway's gender, for example, which is Hemingway's also makes a slight cameo in a poem, would also be a lie, because he is kind of the monument to toxic masculinity, and you can't talk about Hemingway in a neutral way. It is not fair, even to Hemingway, to deny him the legacy that he actually has. And so I went back and reinserted gender.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow. We're almost at our time, but I want to end with a question from the audience, and a particularly resonant one. It's one we hear many times, but I think in light of tonight's conversation, and again, especially in the sense of identity and how that gets expressed in poetry, if each of you could just say, what inspired you to become a poet?
Oh, it's what I do best. So I had no other choice.
No other choice. Great answer. Yeah. How about you, Achy?
No, I was exposed to poetry very early on, so I thought it was actually something that everybody did. My dad was very adamant that when we first came to the States, that I know the poetry of Jose Marti, which is sort of the big guy in Cuban letters. But what really took me there, what really took me to writing in general, and I entered it through poetry, but to writing in general, was discovering that I didn't have an accent when I wrote. I used to have an accent. I used to talk like this, and that was a big deal, especially in like second grade when we were getting beat up for having accents. So I discovered there was this way to be in the world that didn't give that away. So that was really an important discovery, and I fell in love with language immediately.
Right. Well, I think both of your answers are going to inspire future poets, is my feeling. I want to thank you both for this incredible evening, and I want to thank Gary Dop for his superb moderating, and I want to thank our audience for being there, and remind everybody we have other great festival events coming up, both virtually and in person, this Saturday. I want to thank as well our media sponsors, Minneapolis St. Paul Magazine, Minnesota Public Radio, the Star Tribune, and Twin Cities Public Television, as well as, once again, the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council and the Minnesota State Arts Board. Their funding comes from legislative appropriations from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Voters did that. So I want to call that out and praise that. Thanks again to our poets and to everyone watching. Good night.
Oh.
Thank you.